Philosophers have a lot to learn from anthropologists, and so I'm excited to learn from you. I'm sure that I'll learn much more from you than you will from me. In the M notebooks, the notebooks on metaphysics, Darwin remarked that Plato says in the Phaedo that our necessary ideas arise from the pre-existence of the soul, are not derivable from experience, read monkeys for pre-existence. And I think this kind of offhand joke remark of Darwin's in his notebooks is interesting for a variety of reasons, one of which is that Darwin does not seem to be contesting the idea that humans do have necessary, what we might now call innate ideas. Nor does I think Darwin's remark is intended to suggest that our innate ideas are equally present in our primate ancestors. Instead, what Darwin seems to be gesturing toward is a general strategy for explaining the origins of our innate ideas, a strategy that retains an essential role for the formative role of experience in shaping the contents of individual minds. And I think this strategy is an interesting one, and I'm going to pursue it in this talk. What I'm going to pursue it with respect to is recent ideas about the innateness of language. And here, the focus is not on the innate ideas, innate mental content, but innate mental structure, innate mental capacities. In particular, there's an idea that's floating around within generative linguistics, largely associated with the work of Noam Chomsky, but in fact, Eric Lindenberg in the 60s wrote a book kind of that predated a lot of what the kind of biological orientation that Chomsky's work came to take, that insisted on this idea that there is a universal grammar or a language faculty. And I'll say a bit more about what I take a language faculty to be as we go along. But the crucial idea is there's some degree of independence from the experiences that individuals have. There's some respect in which individuals come prepared for language in the way that they may not be prepared for other kinds of things. And this idea is extremely controversial within recent discussions. You can see a slew of recent articles which say things like universal grammar is dead, or that the idea of a language faculty is a myth, or that we should do without any kind of internal innate structure. And so I want to think about this kind of debate that has been taking place. And I think that Darwin's strategy that he gestured toward provides a useful kind of bridge in articulating what's right and wrong about what I think is going on in this debate. And in particular, my aim in this talk is twofold. So I want to defend what I call here the existence claim and also an origins claim. So the existence claim I state quite modestly. It's not actually an existence claim. All I say is that it's not implausible that humans do have a language faculty or something like a universal grammar. So I want to speak up on behalf of these ideas about some innate structure that's at work in human language capacities. But I also want to insist on this origins claim. Namely, this claim that there are substantial social prerequisites on the initial biological evolution of the language faculty, and then on the subsequent persistence and spread of the language faculty across human, or if it's not unique to humans, to hominid populations. And interestingly, it's the conjunction of these two claims that's been very unpopular in recent discussions. So while people who have insisted on this existence claim, people like Chomsky and others, have tended to be very skeptical about explaining the origins of that capacity in terms of appeal to natural selection, and also dismissive of appeals to the role of the social world in shaping that capacity. But then conversely, those that have insisted on the social origins of language have typically been very dismissive of the ideas about the existence of a language faculty. But I think there's a lot of power in combining these two claims and seeing how they work together. As we'll see, the particular kind of proposal that I'm going to make won't be news to people in this crowd. Namely, I'm going to suggest a kind of gene-culture coevolution with a twist. So building on some work of Eva Jablonka's, I'm going to suggest that we should develop this kind of origin claim through a particular kind of culturally driven process of genetic assimilation. So what I'm going to suggest is that in some sense, changes in cultural practices or social forms of life give rise to new kinds of selective pressures, which then can result in the emergence of something like a language faculty. So that's where I'm headed. Crucially, before we go, the one thing I'm going to insist on in interpreting what we mean by the social, I think it's a mistake to assimilate all social interaction to communication. So there's been a tendency in these discussions to assume that if you're going to talk about the social origins of language, you're going to explain how language arose through the needs of complex communication. It's not that I think that kind of story is wrong, I just think it's incomplete. In particular, I don't think that we should think of the social world as being exhausted by interpersonal communication. In a kind of Vygotskian mode or a set of terminologies, I put this by saying something like the zone of proximal dependence between an individual's capacities for internal thought, I think extends far beyond the scope of interpersonal communication. So as I'll try to show, there's a whole variety of ways in which your capacities for internal thought and for internal language might depend on others, communication being one among many of those kinds of forms of dependence. So I'll come back to that. So the outline of what's to follow, I'll say a little bit more about what I take the language faculty to be, and crucially what I take it not to be. I'll then talk about two standard ways of approaching this origins questions or giving an origin explanation. I'll say why I'm not really happy with either of those two standard accounts. I'll then turn to my own kind of social account of the origins of the language faculty, and then I'll close with a few philosophical upshots. One thing about my methodology before I go on, so I'm a philosopher. This is very much a philosopher's talk. So Erica asked if I have any video. I don't have any data. You can ask me whether I have any evidence. But so in what sense, what am I doing? So I think that part of what I'm doing here is philosophy in each of these two senses of the term, both a kind of self-deprecating sense of, well, what I'm mainly doing is offering, making a few distinctions, and I'm clarifying a few concepts. It's kind of a living, as Sidney Morgenbesser famously remarked. But more kind of ambitiously, and this is what you see at work in this quote from Wilfrid Sellers, is that I want to understand how things hang together in very broad senses of the term. So I want to move between kind of different disciplines and sketch how some of these different systems might interact and relate to each other. And so that's kind of the philosophical aspect of my methodology. Is I'll do some clarification of concepts, I'll make some distinctions, but then I'll try to put the pieces together in a sort of unified synoptic way. Okay, so first, the faculty of language. So the first point that I want to do is to clarify what I'm up to. And so I think it's important, questions about the evolution of language have been claimed to be the hardest problem in science. Part of what makes it such a hard problem is there's no such thing as language so understood. That is, there's no such thing as language as a monolithic whole. Instead, we should think about language as existing as a kind of evolutionary mosaic that's made up of different parts that might have interestingly different evolutionary histories. And I think part of some of these debates in this area have come from the fact that people are kind of grabbing onto different parts of the overall system of language. And so, and I think part of the kind of differences in methodology that you see at work here reflect the differences in the actual system of language, the fact that there's different parts that have different kinds of history. Different histories both over evolution but also over the course of development as well. So the thing that I want to start as the explanatory target is not, the focus is not explain the evolution of language, because I think that's not exactly a well-formed kind of problem. So the explanatory target is not every aspect of language, but for me, a certain kind of productive property. Chomsky and others have called this the basic property of language. And the broad idea is that one of the things that language does is enables you to understand a range of sentences or complex phrases that you've never encountered before. So presumably you've never encountered the sentence that Trump read the Chomsky paper while eating French fries and wondering about the definition of perjury. But yet you can understand its meaning. Or likewise, you probably have never heard the sentence that that episode of Game of Thrones reminded me of B.F. Skinner. But somehow you're able, language enables you to make use, in the words of von Humboldt, to make use of some kind of finite means to give rise to some kind of infinite potential. And so there's this basic kind of generative or productive property that's at work in language that allows you to express a range of meanings that you've never encountered before. And for this reason, there's no kind of longest sentence of, let's say, language like English, because for whatever sentence that you've may encountered before, you can always stick something like Sam said or Rowan believes that in front of and make it a little bit longer. So that's a kind of some generative machinery that's at work in language, and that's the target is what makes that possible. And as I said in the abstract for the talk, one of the things is that there's a kind of unconstrained or creative aspect of language that you can see at work here, but it's also constrained in other ways too. So somehow children reliably acquire the capacity to engage in something like this basic property of language. But along the way, they learn that you can say things like no linguist has any brains, but not every linguist has any brains. So while it enables this infinite possibilities, not all possibilities are equally accessible or equally available. And so that's the kind of basic target of the phenomena that I want to explain. This is not, of course, new to Chomsky or to generative linguistics. A number of historical figures have emphasized this basic feature as being one of the interesting things that we want to explain when we're explaining language. So you see in both Darwin and Descartes here a reflection of something like this idea of this basic property is really central, and perhaps this basic property may separate what humans are capable of from what we see other living animals also exhibiting. So it's a kind of a central fact needing to be explained. Now, the generative project begins from this is the basic target phenomena to be explained, and it seeks to explain it in what terms? In terms of something like the positing of this language faculty or universal grammar. So the idea is that's the target phenomena, these generative features, and now we explain that target phenomena in terms of the idea that humans have a language faculty. And as I said, a language faculty it's understood in different ways by different figures. For me, I'm going to treat the language faculty as a biologically guided, species-typical set of cognitive procedures for building linguistic meanings in ways that are unbound but also constrained. So I'll walk through each of the core features that are at work in this definition. The first thing is this idea of this focus on cognitive procedures. So you can think of a cognitive procedure as a set of capacities that give rise to various kinds of phenomena. What kinds of capacities are at work? Well, within the generative tradition, the focus has been on the two boxes on the left-hand side. And so universal grammar you should not think of as a system that necessarily underwrites all the features that are at work in human languages. In fact, in Chomsky's own way of conceptualizing it, the focus has not been on systems like phonology or morphology, but on this kind of what's sometimes called the core language faculty, which is a system that has a set of basic atomic elements that have semantic and pragmatic properties about their meaning and properties about their use, and some generative syntax that allows you to combine those elements in interesting kinds of ways. And the term universal grammar, in the use that I'll put it to, is universal not in the sense necessarily that there's some set of properties that all languages have in common, or even necessarily that there's some set of properties or capacities that show no variation across human populations. That's not what I mean by universal grammar. What I mean by universal grammar is universal in these two senses of the term. Namely, it's a universal grammar in that it involves a workspace of lexical items. You can think of these as kind of word-like elements that are in principle about any subject matter, or that apply across different content domains. So they're not just about objects of visual perception, or about the objects of a social world, or about the notes of some kind of metrical music system. It's potentially about anything. And so this workspace of lexical items could be about, as I say, apply across content domains. And so various kinds of selectional restrictions that might constrain what the elements of the lexicon can be about are somehow relaxed. And so it's universal in that sense. It could be about any subject matter. And then the second respect in which I think this is a kind of a system of universal grammar is that it involves generative features which can merge the items stored in the lexicon recursively so as to apply to a potentially infinite range of expressions. So you can take this kind of workspace of elements and then just build up recursively, including applying to the application of things you've already built up through those operations. And that's the sense in which I mean in talking about humans having a universal grammar. Now, And that's the sense in which I think that the language faculty involves these kinds of cognitive procedures. Now, it's also species typical, and this is what people, when they usually think about universal grammar, they're thinking about some fact that's universal across human populations. And in some sense, I do think that's true. It's species typical. This is sometimes said as species unique. I think that there's not quite determinate evidence on that matter, as I'll come back to at the end of the talk. But it's species typical in that I think that you see these capacities at work. Both it's resilient across cultural groups, so you don't find cultural groups that lack this basic feature. But it's also resilient across learning environments. So this has been brought out very beautifully by work by Lila Gleitman, but also Susan Goldman Meadow. So in this really nice book, The Resilience of Language, she does this in-depth study of deaf children born into families that don't have a conventional sign language. And so you have these children who are engaged in social interaction, are cared for and loved, but don't seem like they have much by way of linguistic input. But you still see this basic property emerging in the systems that's supporting it emerging. And so in that sense, it's, I think, resilient across a really wide range of learning environments. It's species typical in that you see these resilience, but yet it seems that these basic capacities are lacking in other living animals. It's species typical. And then the last thing that's supposed to be at work, and actually it turns out in the contemporary discussions, this is the crucial question. The crucial debate centers on whether or not, the debate centers on not whether there are these kinds of cognitive capacities, but whether these cognitive capacities have a biological basis. And by a biological basis, I mean that quite inclusively. So I don't just mean a claim about the human genome, although that's included. So in saying there's a biological basis, I mean that in saying, well, these capacities, cognitive capacities, have some, perhaps a genomic signature, but they also have crucial developmental signatures. So there might be a crucial kind of developmental window, a critical period, if you will, in which acquisition takes place or is easier. There might be signatures that it has on the length of either a childhood or adolescence. So there's which may not quite be explicitly coded in genes. But so that's genetic and developmental, but also morphological, and that there might be a specific set of brain regions that are not the only brain regions that are involved in these kinds of computations, but centrally involved in those kinds of computations. So it's biologically implemented in that sense, these cognitive capacities. OK, so that's what I think the language faculty is. Now, what is it not? Well, as I've said already, do not think of the universal grammar or the language faculty, I'm going to move back and forth between those two modes of description, as a set of properties that all languages have in common, so-called descriptive universals. There's interesting questions about whether there are such things, but as far as the kind of generative approach to language is concerned, it doesn't require those things. You might expect that if there is this language faculty, that would give rise to descriptive universals of the sort that was famously studied by Joseph Greenberg. But it's not an entailment of the view that there are these kinds of universals, and so the failure to find universals of that kind does not count as evidence against the existence of a language faculty. Second, do not think of the language faculty as a hodgepodge of a large number of arbitrary, so-called non-functional rules that have nothing to do with the way agents come to think about, to represent, or act on their worlds. There's a kind of, the standard way I think, especially non-linguists have thought about universal grammar is a bunch of rules that are hard to formulate. There's a huge list of them. They're all encoded in the genome, and then they show no kind of developmental signature. It turns out that especially after the emergence of the so-called minimalist program that Chomsky initiated in the early 90s, this is not how linguists think about the relevant generative operations. In fact, the way that Chomsky now tends to describe the generative operations is it consists in a single rule, maybe one additional rule, but the rule is this merge. And what merge tells you is to take two items and put them together in ways that don't bring about any changes to the two elements that you've combined. So you start with these initial sequence of these initial elements here. You then build up things in ways that effectively just consist of a set of those two elements you started with. And the strong minimalist thesis is that that's all there is to the generative operations that are at work in language, plus some auxiliary principles that tell you how to map those to these interfaces. So you start with this very, very simple generative procedure, and then a lot of the complication consists in how you actually externalize that to systems of phonology or morphosyntax. And this is not, it's not a large number of arbitrary rules, but they're also not arbitrary in the sense of don't think of these as being non-functional in the sense that they don't contribute to the way that individuals are thinking about the world. In fact, the way that this is often described as a kind of language of thought. It's a way of formatting the mental representations that agents have in particular kinds of ways, in particular in ways that reflect both the lexicon and these generative principles. So it's I think, wrong to describe them as non-functional in this sense of the term. They contribute to how individuals are representing the world. And the last thing, again, is something I've been saying a little bit as I've gone along, but don't think necessarily that universal grammar in this sense is something that is necessarily present at birth or independent of learning. And I'll just refer you to this very nice paper of Charles Yang's called UG Statistics Are Both to get a kind of concrete sense of how this is supposed to work. But the idea that in Yang's paper is something like UG is not don't think of it as a domain-specific set of learning rules. Think of it as a kind of standard Bayesian statistics as applied to a structured hypothesis space. So it's not going to develop independent of general learning rules. The question is what kinds of constraints are imposed on the learning that children are doing. OK, so that's the target phenomena. These are some clarifications about what I think that UG is. I think that already once you get these clarifications, some of the standard kinds of criticisms that have been made against the approach are not very forceful because I think they're not targeting views that people have actually endorsed. So UG is dead in the sense that Tomasello means here, but it turns out it was never alive. At least it hasn't been alive since the mid-'80s. So I do think that there are things to say that are critical of the kind of Chomskyan program, and I'm going to turn to those in just a minute. But these are not, I think, the areas that you should criticize the program. So that's the existence claim. And now the interesting kind of question I want to ask is, suppose you go along with me in accepting the existence claim, how do you explain its evolution? And if you're not moved by the existence claim, at least give me a pinch of salt and entertain the conditional. Suppose you were to endorse the existence claim, how would you explain the evolution of the faculty so described? So that's the rest of the talk is sort of on the conditional assumption that there is a language faculty in this sense of the term. OK. So most of the early work in this kind of generative tradition you can kind of think of as trying to answer Plato's problem. So Plato's problem is, how do you move from, how is it that children acquire these really rich systems of language from a seemingly impoverished set of input? So it seems like kids acquire really, really rich capacities, but the capacities outstrip what they're given in terms of input. And if you want a kind of the most forceful version of that, that's the Golden Meadow style case of these home sign languages. It seems like you have no linguistic input or minimal linguistic input and really rich capacities. But now, so how do you explain Plato's problem, but also at the same time explain Darwin's problem? Namely, explaining how you could explain these rich capacities given only known evolutionary mechanisms like genetic drift and the like. And there's been, in the literature, two kind of broad styles of ways of trying to combine an answer to Plato's problem in a way that's consistent with an answer to Darwin's problem. One that thinks about UG as evolving gradually to facilitate complex interpersonal communication. Another account has insisted that no, UG did not develop gradually to facilitate interpersonal communication. Instead, UG developed rapidly to facilitate internal thought in individuals. And I'm going to say these are both onto something important, but neither of them is accurate as typically developed. So the standard kind of communication-based answer to Darwin's problem was famously articulated in a paper in the early 90s by Steve Pinker and Paul Bloom. It's also been a kind of style of account that you've seen, you can see developed in some of Ray Jackendoff's work, and in this nice book by Jim Herford called The Origins of Grammar. But the kind of idea is you can start with the kind of one-word signals of living primates, and then you can kind of build up sequentially more complex systems of communication over time. So you kind of have a stage of just one-word signs, then you start getting a couple words or many word signs, and then you get some interesting kind of phrase structure, and then you go from there to thinking about lexical structure, and then finally at the end of this you get the full kind of recursive structures that you see at work in modern human languages. And at each stage, according to this kind of story that Pinker and Bloom developed, at each stage you kind of get increased selection on genetic capacity supporting them. So there's a biological stage that corresponds to this, a biological stage that corresponds to this, and so forth and so on. And it's a kind of interesting and appealing story. It seems like it has a kind of plausible gradualist dimensions to it. So effectively, most of Chomsky's discussions of the evolution of language have been reasons why he hates this kind of story. This is actually a sort of nice quote for Chomsky standards. It's been convenient to regard language as a system whose function is communication. To the extent that this characterization has any meaning, it appears to be incorrect. Why is he saying this? Well, there's a variety of reasons. Let me start with the last one. One reason he thinks that is he thinks that it's wrong to suggest that the function of language is communication because language has lots of different functions. And in particular, he thinks that one of the roles of language is not necessarily to facilitate coordination or communication between agents, but to initiate a certain kind of robust thought within agents. And so he thinks that we do a lot of thinking internally. We're kind of, structure our own monologues in a linguistic format. But you also use language when you're trying to deceive. So maybe language was invented so as to lie, as Diderot once said, or to engage in conflict between agents rather than cooperative communication. And so he thinks there's a variety of things that language does apart from communication. Why think that language is being maximized to facilitate communication? I think that's probably not the strongest argument that he gives. The two other arguments that you see that show up throughout his work is one, and this is the kind of general argument that he gives, is that the syntactic operations that seem to be at work in human languages are not governed by linear order, but by principles of structure dependence. So that is, the principles do not go by way of how close in the linear format the words of a sentence are to one another, but seem like they turn on other more general kinds of features, namely features of kind of structural relatedness. And he thinks that if you're going to explain how UG arose through a process of communication, you would expect the grammatical principles to reflect principles of linear order rather than principles of structure dependence. And so he thinks this is just a general reason to think that communication can't be what's being maximized in the evolution of UG. The last thing, and this has kind of been a focus in some recent work, is that he thinks actually when you look at, if you go down to these kinds of features here, there's a ton of variation in how the world's languages realize these features. And there's not a kind of enough stability or resilience in those features cross-culturally to support the idea that they're developmentally resilient. So the kind of argument is that in contrast to this kind of basic operation of merge, most of those other operations will not be part of the kind of biological toolkit that individuals inherit. Instead, there'll be things that arrive by kind of historical processes of cultural evolution, not through a process of biological evolution. And so it's a kind of merge is the only thing that could plausibly be regarded as part of the biological toolkit. And so on these other stories, they're including features that are sort of gratuitous once you get merge, and there's no other way to explain. You can't, it seems like you go from one-word signs in terms of communication to the full recursive structure. So these are considerations that Chomsky gives for thinking that this kind of story is not going to work, and then supports this alternative kind of story. And so this alternative story centers on the idea that the point of language is actually to facilitate thought. And the evolutionary account says things like, well, the core principle of language must have arisen from some small rewiring of the brain, presumably the effect of some small mutation. As for why UG rather than some other form emerged, well, the best answer might just be, well, it's a slight evolutionary event that yielded merge, and then the rest is history, as they say. I'll come back to this claim about the role of language in behavioral modernity, but it's hard not to see this style of evolutionary account as engaging a kind of salutationist, hopeful monster kind of picture, where there was a single evolutionary mutation. It brought about the central thing, and once it came, it dramatically increased the capacity of the creatures to survive and reproduce. But it's otherwise, it's what, as I say, biologists have thought about as a kind of hopeful monster. And it doesn't help that his co-authors have titled their papers things like syntax takes leaps. Because it just seems like, well, there's this evolutionary leap. So syntax does take leaps. There's a salutationary kind of story according to which syntax just comes on the scene kind of seemingly out of nowhere, from nothing. And this, I think, just won't do. And I think there's a variety of both conceptual and empirical problems with this suggestion. One is that I think the story that Chomsky gives doesn't take seriously the cumulative character of evolutionary change. So the idea here is that whether the evolutionary innovation is coming from a mutation or from a recombination, not all of those mutations or recombinations are all probabilistically equal. So the Chomsky's recent book is called Why Only Us? And I think it's exactly that which he doesn't explain. So it's only, I think, if you take seriously the idea that the chance of a mutation occurring is sensitive to the state of the organism or the population prior to that mutation. And so the fact that a language seems like it emerged in a primate in Africa is, I think, not an accident that it didn't develop in a domestic cat or in an ant. And I think that it turns on the prior cumulative character involving selection beforehand. The other two kinds of things that I think are relevant here is that there's a kind of conflation of questions about the speed by which individuals undergo various kinds of steps and questions about the need for sequential steps at all. So I think it's an open question how fast members of a population went through various kinds of steps. It does not seem to be an open question whether there were some steps of this kind at all. So, I mean, just to summarize some of these considerations here, I think that even if it's the case that universal grammar arose as a single chance mutation or recombination, its emergence is not independent of prior selection on social and ecological capacities. And it's that idea that I then now want to kind of turn to in developing a kind of synthesis of what I think is right and wrong about these two kind of existing stories. So let me turn to that. So, in Darwin's initial suggestion, he said, C for preexistence, C monkeys. And that's kind of what I think that we should do in thinking about the evolution of language. We should think about what we know about primate evolutionary history, building on I think, a lot of really rich emerging work. So let me focus on, so the kind of question is how to fill in the gaps from what we know from living primates and modern human populations to what must have had taken place in the course of human evolutionary history. So the two central points that I want to make, and I'm going to have to make them quick, is that the first is that I think there's good reason, as again everyone in this room knows, to think that social and ecological problems require living primates to utilize structurally rich cognitive capacities. And these cognitive capacities, I think, were enriched over the entire course of hominid evolutionary history. So again, this first point is well known. In recent work on free-ranging baboons, Seyfarth and Cheney, and I think Seyfarth may be talking about this when he's here in a couple of weeks, so come back for his talk for actual data, that there's good reason to think that members in primate groups have a sense of who the other members of their population are in something of a linear dominance hierarchy. So they know who the other members of their group are and where they belong in this dominance hierarchy. And what's interesting about this is that where an individual belongs in the hierarchy is not determined just by immediate features of their size or how old they are, but features that emerge through the course of their interactions with each other. Why I think this is so important is that I think that you can see this representation of the social world that you see at work in primates as a kind of context in which individuals in the primate lineage engage in something like merge-based forms of internal thought. So this is not a form of thought that follows immediately from the perceptually inspectable features of the environments that they find themselves in. They have to be read off through the prior interaction stored in memory. So, if you think about how I describe merge, the operation of merge takes atomic elements and then combines them in ways that don't necessarily bring about changes in the things that you first started with. That's the operation of merge. There has to be a form of cognition that does something quite analogous to that to represent a linear dominance hierarchy. You start with individuals, you merge them into families or kin or friends, and then you merge those individuals or groups into further groups, namely a dominance hierarchy group. That's a kind of merge-based thinking. So this is not language because there are selectional restrictions on the subject matter that these representations are about, namely they're about the social world. So it's not a language system yet, but yet I think there are comparable differences between the kind of structural operations you see at work in human syntax and the kinds of structural operations that are at work in the syntax of the social world. That's kind of what we know from living primates, but I think there's reason to think that building on these kinds of initial capacities for representing the social world, you see over the course of human evolutionary history the kind of need to integrate those social representations with other representations that have different formats. So you're making a decision about foraging and avoiding predators while foraging, and you're having to integrate those representations of the presence or not of a predator with your representations of the social world. And you can start going on to think about, well, you're integrating that also with in the context of larger groups. So Dunbar and others have done a lot to show interesting kinds of correlations between the size of social groups and the size of neocortexes and overall brain to body size ratios that are also showing, I think, the need to integrate larger or kind of more memory demands on social representations with other kinds of representations as well. And you could just kind of go on and on through other instances of the need to integrate hierarchical representations with the representations of the social world. You can think about extractive foraging in gorillas. This case has been controversial because it's unclear how much of the actual shape of the branch is involved in the hierarchical representation of the plan to take the branch apart to get the goodies inside. It's uncontroversial that by the time you get our Oldowan and Acheulean hand axes being made, that this is a kind of offline thinking that's not given just by the structure of the stone tool that you're crafting. So here's another case of a kind of hierarchical form of in this case, ecological or tool-based cognition that's mediated by your interaction with others. So you're integrating your representations of the social world. Here you're near somebody observing how they're making a tool, and then coming to compute some kind of hierarchical representation of how to build the stone tool. So here's the kind of sense of the kinds of hierarchical representations that are at work in this kind of plan. And again, as I said, I think that in this literature you could kind of go on and further other examples of this. Richard Wrangham has argued that there's good evidence that food processing techniques also involve something like these kind of hierarchical organization that are being mediated by your representations of the social world. Sarah Hurdy has emphasized similar things for the capacities that I work in alloparenting. I won't dwell on the points. The kind of interim summary here, though, is that you start with representations of the social world that we know that other living primates exhibit, and you're seeing the need to integrate those kinds of representations across a range of different content domains. So you have to integrate your social representations with your representations of how to do optimal foraging, or how to make a tool, or how to engage in highly structured planned activities, like making the stone tool, or who's going to watch my baby while I go out foraging. So this is what, at the outset, when I said something about the need to think beyond just the context of interpersonal communication and thinking about the social dependency of internal modes of thought, I just went through a list of contexts in which individuals are engaging in rich, structured forms of internal thought that are being scaffolded by the activities of others that include communication but are not wholly reducible to communication. And I think it's in this context that we should think about the evolution of language. And so this is getting to the kind of punchline of this idea of there being social preconditions for the evolution of the kind of biological emergence of the language faculty. And the kind of idea here is that you start with cultural practices, changes in the kind of form of life that the creature is engaging in, that include the social world, but also include the ways that the social world facilitates or scaffolds things like tool use or hierarchical forms of food processing techniques. And the demands of engaging in those kinds of cultural practices create novel kinds of selective pressures that might bring about biological relevant changes. So this is again just a standard gene culture coevolution kind of dynamic, but the thought is that it's culturally driven, it's culturally initiated. So you see the kind of cultural practices coming on the scene first, and then those changing kind of selective pressures that might select for or kind of unmask hidden genetic variation that's already been present in the population. This kind of idea was kind of first emphasized in work by Waddington in the 50s and demonstrated something like the power of this process in fruit flies. So this was just environmentally induced genetic change. He called it genetic assimilation. In more recent discussions, so as I said before, I'm building on work in particular by Eva Jablonka and collaborators, but I think you can see this playing out in the context of human evolution with a culturally driven form of genetic assimilation. And I think once you appreciate the power of this kind of evolutionary dynamic, it puts these kind of bizarre claims of Chomsky's in a new light. Because I think once you appreciate the power of this dynamic, it's not implausible that merge might have arisen from some rewiring of the brain, presumably the effect of a small mutation. And why that happened rather than some other thing, well, there was a very slight evolutionary event. Well, yes, it may have been a slight evolutionary event because of the prior selection on these social cognitive capacities, social ecological capacities. And so the kind of story that Chomsky is giving is not implausible when you actually give it an appropriate evolutionary kind of framework to develop the claims in. At least that's the claim that I'm making. And so the thought here is that what Chomsky's mostly interested in explaining is two here, the emergence of merge. And the thought is, well, merge might have come about through this culturally driven process of genetic assimilation. One thing that's interesting about the Chomsky's discussion, however, he leaves the thing in one here completely underspecified. He claims it's a mystery, not just a problem, where a mystery is something that is beyond the grip of our human cognitive capacities to understand. So that is the thing at work in one here is the development of this rich lexicon that applies across different kinds of content domains. The story that I just gave involving this culturally driven process of genetic assimilation can explain both 1 and 2 together. You're in a context in which you have to engage in a really wide range of cognitive activities concerning how to represent other members of your group, how to build effective tools for extractive foraging, how to engage in the actual foraging routes themselves, how to make these plans, even offline plans before they're taking place. You're having to do all those things and integrate those representations in a way that they can be compared. And it's in that context that I think that you can see something like this system emerging. So as I come to a close, so I think this is a way to explain something like Plato's problem, because in this context, once these capacities emerge, there might be some kind of environmental buffering. That's exactly what Waddington was gesturing toward. So he had this idea of canalization, where no matter where the ball starts, it's going to wind up at the bottom of the hill because of the canals here in the developmental landscape. And so I do think that this kind of story can explain why you see such resilient properties at work in language. Well, because it was part of these forms of life that effectively, if you couldn't compute, if you couldn't engage in, there was very little chance of your survival. But crucially, it's not merely a fact about genes. So the other thing that Waddington emphasized is the way in which this kind of canalization depended on a whole wide realm of kind of a developmental landscape, these pulleys. So it wasn't, you shouldn't just think of it as a single gene that ensures the development of this character, but a whole landscape of development that ensures that it will be reliably developed. And I think that, if we're really going to give a kind of a serious story about the biological basis of language, you need to take seriously that the story is going to produce biological-based changes, not just in genes, but the whole regulatory system and the developmental system more generally. And so I'm not saying that these cultural practices bring about genetic changes and that's the end of the story. But I do think that certain kinds of genetic changes can be a crucial part of the overall story involving these multiple developmental pathways. So that's the attempt to synthesize. So the story that I just gave is a gradualist story, but it's not just a story that turns on complex interpersonal communication. It's a gradual story that turns on the role the role that language plays in facilitating internal thought. However, it's an internal thought that you can only engage in because of the activities of others. So it's a socially mediated or kind of socially grounded form of internal thought. And I think this story gives an interesting kind of bridge between the kind of story that that Chomsky has always articulated, but the kind of more familiar dynamics that you see at work in Darwinian-based kind of evolutionary accounts. So in the remaining 2 or 3 minutes, let me just close with some brief philosophical upshots. One upshot, again, this is not news, but I think it's just another context in which to insist on its importance, is the respect in which I think traditional dichotomies, it turns out, are not dichotomous. It's not that there are not distinctions to be made in this vicinity, it's just that they're not dichotomies. It's not one or the other. So, what I love about the Darwin quote that I started with is the idea that he's kind of integrating rationalist and empiricist modes of thought. You do have the rationalist insistence on innate ideas, but you ground it in facts about experience. Likewise, I think that the dichotomy between formalist and functionalist modes of explanations in linguistic theory has outlived its use, and it's time to move on from those kinds of dichotomies. And I think when you start thinking about the evolutionary questions, every formalist is a functionalist, it turns out. Because when you start thinking about evolutionary change, it's inevitable that you're going to start talking about the role that the formal structures will play in survival, reproduction, and facilitating certain forms of life. On the other hand, it doesn't undermine the need to think about formal structures that might have some kind of buffering from the environments that the children find themselves in that are invariant across those kinds of environments. And likewise, cognitive versus social or genetic versus cultural, these dichotomies have, I think, it's not that there are not distinctions here. Again, I'm not saying that there's just a mush and there's no way to draw the line between these things. It's just that they interact in interesting kinds of ways, and a lot of the interest comes from understanding the interactions between these components. So that's one philosophical upshot. Another philosophical upshot is I think UG is not the end-all and be-all of the evolutionary mosaic of language. And this contrasts with the way that Chomsky often describes things. So I started by saying the explanatory target that I'm interested in is not language writ large, but one part of this overall mosaic of language. And I think that's true. And so I've kind of been mostly thinking about this quadrant down here. And I think that in order to explain the emergence of language as a whole, you're going to tell different kinds of stories. And what I've told here is just a small part of that overall kind of story. And this is relevant for the quote of Chomsky's that I didn't read. Namely, he uses data involving the so-called emergence of behavioral modernity in the archaeological record the emergence of things like symbolic artifacts, the emergence of things like wide-scale changes in cultural groups and cultural landscapes as a proxy for language, and in particular a proxy for universal grammar, by Chomsky's own lights, that's a fallacious inference. Because it turns out that he thinks that a lot of the facts involving behavioral modernity, involving things like symbolic expression, those are all part of externalization anyways. They're not part of the core syntactic operations. And so the fact that you see them lacking in a population is not a good reason to think that that population doesn't have language. And so the fact that Homo erectus did not, or the Neanderthals did not seem like they made symbolic artifacts is not a good reason to think that they didn't have UG by Chomsky's own lights. And in my own view, a lot of this, this behavioral modernity that you do see, it turns out it's probably not the great leap forward. It turns out the record's more complicated than people initially made it out to be. But even still, I do think that the emergence of something like a merge-based syntactic operation of the sort that's at work at UG is part of the core background enabling conditions that makes that possible. But I don't think it's the key innovation. I think that probably, if I can make a prediction off the record, I actually think that UG, in the sense that I've been talking throughout this whole talk, is actually ancient in the hominid line. So I think it could possibly be as old as the Homo genus full stop. So I'm willing to guess that it might be, you might find evidence that even Homo erectus had UG in this sense. But they're not, they didn't have language in the sense that modern humans have language, not because they didn't have the core kind of syntactic or semantic operations, but because those syntactic semantic operations weren't integrated with all the rest of these components of language. In particular, I think that probably, you couldn't do much with UG in the sense that I've been discussing it until you have changes in the social tolerance of agents. How close can they get to one another without erupting into violence? What kinds of social norms govern behavior? How interested and likely are you to engage in symbolic expression of your internal modes of thought? I think those are the kinds of things that are at work in behavioral modernity. And there's, again, UG might enable those things as part of a background condition, like changes in oxygen may enable creatures to move onto land, but it's not the spark that explains the rest of it. So one philosophical upshot here, just to summarize, and then I'll shut up, is just you have to be aware of the way in which the basic a system or an individual can display the basic generative property of language without showing signs of behavioral modernity. And so, we can't move so quickly from one to the other. And lastly, as kind of an evidence of, or kind of an illustration of this, I've mostly been focusing here on the syntactic operations, but I think explaining what makes human language so special has a lot to do with the lexicon, explaining how children acquire words so quickly. And I think it's the kind of evolutionary story that I've been spinning here is relevant for explaining how those changes, not just in syntactic capacities, but in the lexical capacities of agents emerge. But I think it requires attention to very specific detail, which I haven't gone into, but I think this is kind of where the action is in moving forward in thinking about the evolution of UG. So with that, I'll close. Thanks so much. Sure. Sure.
So, given everything you said about the existence of hierarchical/recursive properties and operations and capacities outside of the domain of language, going back millennia, why should we still believe that merge, if any such thing exists, is a language-specific property?
Good. That's a great question. So. One thing that I've downplayed a little bit in the Chomskyan program is the domain specificity of language. So if you read Chomsky's writings in the 60s and 70s, it's all about language is different from other kinds of activities that individuals engage in. What does this account suggest about domain specificity? Well, in one sense, I think that the question about domain specificity is an empirical question and it should be treated as such. but in some sense, I guess what I think that the way to think about domain specificity, and this is kind of building on some of Clark's stuff, is actually the domain specificity of language is in its generality. So it's this kind of, what makes language specific to a domain is a domain that can apply across domains. So Clark has, I think, called this a meta-domain in some sense. And so in some sense, what I think that what you see as specific to language is not that it has some set of generative operations or computational operations that are used in language and only used in language. So if you kind of follow these recent discussions, this is what Chomsky, Hauser, Fitch called the faculty of language in the narrow sense. I don't think that's not how I want to think about the domain specificity of language. So they want to think about the domain specificity of language as properties that are at work in language and only at work in language and also uniquely human. I think that it's implausible that there are going to be properties that a brain would use only in one context and only in that context. But I do think there's a kind of specificity in that there's a system that has this kind of general purpose dimension to it, for which you can then put something in a slot, this lexical slot, and then compute it in hierarchical and recursive ways. So paradoxically, it makes, as I say, the domain specificity of language turn on its generality. But I agree that's a different way of thinking about domain specificity than I think you see in a lot of the early discussions of Chomsky. Yeah.
Great talk. It was, like you said, you grounded this in saying that a lot of folks in this audience would be already pretty much on board with the idea that you've got gene culture coevolution, and so you, in that sense, have both social and other systems of inheritance influencing this evolution. But in this audience, your statement about something could have happened early in the evolution of our genus that would give a rise to, or at least contribute significantly to, some mental constructs being used in other domains now being repurposed possibly for facilitating what we would call language. So there are people who have made similar claims about the early socio-ecological context of early Homo or Homo erectus as well, that put a finer point on features of that social environment, of that cultural environment. So, and I just wonder what your thoughts are on these. So you can look at Bickerton, who in Adam's Tongue talks about how spatial temporal planning for events that are occurring over the horizon. And this could be scavenging, this could be hunting, this could be gathering, whatever it is. It's a shift in the way that social groups are spatially organized. And you have also claims by Terence Deacon about, again, it's a spatio-temporal coordination issue of, that seems to be a possible shift in the socioecology that they claim would have lent itself to some of the capacities of the language. So what are your thoughts on what was going on in terms of in the proto-human context prior to this, more significant shift in cognitive abilities that might have laid the selective environment for selection on these traits?
I'm open to any and all of these styles of account. So, I think that if you think about changes in upright posture, changes in more of a bipedal lifestyle, all of these are suggesting changes in the foraging patterns of the creatures, exhibiting larger home ranges, moving between ranges, searching for food sources. I think that those really start getting more closer to, and I think part of what is especially relevant for thinking about early Homo is the use of extractive foraging. So not just long distance foraging, but extractive tools. So where you're really thinking about environmental modification. So not just finding the environment and then moving between the environment as you find it, but really bringing about changes in the environment. And so you're kind of constructing an environment I think those are all central. But you have to think about it. I mean, I guess the thing that I want to insist on is none of that does much unless it's integrated with other facts about social life. Sure. And so part of the insistence here is on the need to integrate these different factors. It's going to be hard to pull out the proximate and the ultimate factors in terms of what's the function that's really being realized versus what's just an enabling condition. So what's a cause versus the core driver of the dynamic. And I think that I don't know if there's enough evidence. I mean, partially because you have to have these changes in food processing, or at least resource accesses, to explain changes in brain size. Because the brain is such an expensive bit of tissue that you need to have changes in diet to fuel it. But conversely, things like alloparenting, those might be and having third generational means of cultural transmission might be give you a huge leg up in terms of your ability to survive. But you're only going to be able to do that supposing you have the relevant kind of change in diet. And so, I
totally agree with all of that. I just wanted to, what I was trying to emphasize is that two of the most prominent theories in this realm have the specific element of needing to convey information that's not in your immediate surroundings, and potentially share, modify, discuss, critique that information in your social group.
Good.
So that's a general. I'm not claiming either of those are that's the key issue. I'm just wondering if that common feature, because you started by sort of downplaying, or at least trying to reconcile the communicative, strong version of the communicative hypothesis with the internal thought representation. But I'm just wondering if by doing that, I don't see in this list, for example, individuals being distributed across the landscape out of visual contact with one another.
Good. Yeah. So
being relevant.
So the two things. I mean, one thing that it's right that part of what I'm emphasizing is the way in which these changes are changes in a mode of thinking that include changes in the mode of thinking about other agents, and including how to coordinate with those individuals, possibly over a dispersed landscape. But I think that in some of these discussions, the need to coordinate is being put at a premium over the need to change the mode of internal thinking. And I don't think that there's a conflict between the two, because the mode of internal thinking is being transformed by your interactions with others. But don't think of it all of the function as being always involving this system of coordination, because I think it's equally relevant for thinking about conflict as it is for thinking about coordination. And so that's the only thing, the only wrinkle that I'm adding to these kinds of stories, in some sense, is the emphasis of it's about the way that individuals are finding their way around in the world and how they navigate a social world. But you need to think about the capacities being realized by individuals in individual cognitive frames that include communication and coordination, but include other things as well. Here and then here. At two here, we go to 1 and 2, and then 3. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I am interested in hearing more about your views about the language organ in relation to the general cognitive architecture, if that is possible. So there was a time where people like Peter Carruthers used to talk about the language module as being an adaptation that came about because our ancestors had all these different cognitive modules that needed, or that became more efficient, more powerful once they had this unifying system, a language. So, so your talk about the meta language or the meta module sounds similar to that, but originally I didn't think that's what you were trying to say.
The roles that I've been insisting on of the role of language in mediating thought, I think you can think of Carruthers' framework as a specific implementation of that broad idea. So Carruthers has this idea that you have a bunch of internal modules, and they all have their distinctive kind of principles and domains that they apply to, but then you need some module that, as it were, communicates internally to to the different modules, and maybe the point of language is to facilitate that. And that is all up the alley of the things that I'm suggesting, but I hadn't said anything about the existence, the failure to do that outside the context of having language. So, I mean, Crothers is part of what makes Crothers' thesis radical is the idea that there's not a global workspace of kind of sharing information between modules prior to language. And nothing I've said commits me to that, so his thesis is more radical than mine. But conversely, evidence that he has in favor of his hypothesis, I can marshal also in favor of this idea that, yes, part of what makes language so interesting is both the communicative role that it's playing, but also this internal role in thinking. Whether you characterize that in terms of cross-modular talk or not, want to be somewhat neutral on, but it's, as I say, a specific implementation of a kind of broad idea that it's working here.
If I can have
Sure.
a quick follow-up.
Sure.
Yes, with your observation that, well, you see the domain specificity as being the fact that this capacity can access different databases or different systems, subsystems. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you think of the language system as having domain specificity in that sense, but not being encapsulated, what Fodor used to call encapsulated, information that is encapsulated, that had this dedicated database. Instead, it's more general purpose in that sense.
Yeah, so, part of why I kind of am hesitant to talk about modules is because there's very different ways of characterizing what a module is supposed to be. And Fodor was my professor in grad school, and so I tend to, when I talk about modules, revert to Fodor talk. But it would make no sense for there to be an encapsulated system of language in the sense that I just characterized. And so it wouldn't be a specialized module in the sense that Fodor is using module talk. Crothers is only meaning by a module something much weaker, such that encapsulation wouldn't apply to it. But yeah, I think it's hard to see how encapsulation or a set of proprietary principles that apply to language and only language would work given what I'm saying here.
The function you want language to play.
Yeah. In Fodor's defense, he was mostly only talking about the generative procedure here, not the lexicon. But I've been emphasizing part of what I think distinguishes the generative operations that are at work in language from the generative operations that might be at work in social cognition is the fact that they operate on a global workspace or this kind of workspace of lexical items. But he was thinking that the encapsulated thing is syntactic processing, not the lexicon. So, question? Yeah.
So you've been explaining different theories about language when humans were small in number and geographically isolated, and as they expanded in number and migrated, there were many different languages that evolved. Is that just part of the same understanding of universal grammar, just a variation, or is it a different thing, and does the multiplicity of languages have, in your view, any evolutionary benefit? Why do we have it?
So, I think that one of the benefit might be a system of encryption. So that if you're interested in conveying information to those in your group, but preventing those outside of your group from identifying that information, it might be good to have variation with respect to the communication protocols that you're using. And on this picture, you should think of universal grammar as effectively emerging from stable regularities that hold across the different kinds of variable systems that you might be encountering. And so if you think about this idea from Waddington of the kind of a kind of environmental buffering, the idea is that it's not that the environment doesn't trigger certain things, it's that no matter what environment you find yourself in, you're going to need this capacity. And so you wouldn't want to assimilate genetically or biologically features that are specific to one cultural group and not another. And so stable features that would occur across groups, those would be the kinds of things that would tend to be assimilated on this kind of picture. And I think there's lots of reasons why the variation is at the heart of all the dynamics here, because without variation, you don't have any interesting evolutionary dynamics. But from a functional point of view, the variation might be, So the one part of variation may just be that's the nature of the beast, and it's an inevitable part of facts about acquisition and transmission that you get some variation. But as I said, the core functional thing might be for intergroup coordination, but failure to get coordination out of group. And then if that's so, then there would be a reason to get lots of variation. In the principles and parameters framework that was popular in generative linguistics in the 80s, there was a suggestion that, well, maybe one reason why you have some universal principles, but then parameters which languages vary, is because of the need for encryption. So the syntactician Mark Baker suggested something like that. And I think that's an interesting suggestion for why you might see functionally variation in language systems. Here.
So first, I think it's important to point out that while there are investigators who think that dichotomies are not dichotomous, there are also investigators who think that, sorry, bad joke. Let me turn to, more seriously, to your remarks about merge as being a meta-domain. While that's plausible with regard to this general logic, it doesn't necessarily explain the empirical features that we see today, in that, for example, language acquisition has a critical window, but other features of culture acquisition seem not to. And in fact, importantly, many features of culture acquisition, including in small-scale societies that plausibly resemble those in accessible environments, skill acquisition critically increases throughout not just the childhood period, but continues to accelerate through adolescence and young adulthood, where skill peaking doesn't occur until, depending on the skill, somewhere between 20 and 40, for example, right? So it seems to me that a potential solution to that is not to be wedded to the idea that to divorce this phylogenetic process that you've laid out from the extant configuration by proposing that you can have serial homology wherein you get a merge faculty, for example, that initially is very domain general, and a version of it continues to operate in a domain general fashion, but it is duplicated through neural reuse in a way that its duplicate is then much more specialized, right? And by virtue of that specialization, it has a bunch of expenses attached to it that are not, and limitations across other domains, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't have the kind of general purpose tool feature that merge writ large has. But by virtue of the additional expenses and the limitations, it's worth making it time limited in terms of its learning window.
So I mean, as a special case of that, you might think that there would be specific effects that something like literacy may have on brains that would not show the same kind of signatures for language writ large. So so if I'm following the ideas, there's a kind of general purpose device that shows sort of critical periods, but then there are things that you can pick up later that may be more specialized that emerge from the reuse of those earlier general purpose.
I mean, that's possible, but it's not the thesis that I was proposing. The thesis that I was proposing is that the original merge is indeed, its proper domain is a metadomain, okay? And it still exists.
Yeah.
It's there, but it has been duplicated and specialized in its duplication, just like a general purpose tooth is duplicated and you get specialized teeth.
Yeah.
And they coexist in the same mouth.
Yeah.
That specialized version has added costs to it and particularities that the general purpose version doesn't. And by virtue of those added costs, it's worth making it time limited in terms of its acquisition function.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that I think that you could definitely see something like that working is in all these principles that are language principles and specific to languages, but there's a lot of variation with respect to how they're realized in the world's languages. Might be a kind of version of that in that these are all merge-based in some ways, but they're super specialized to different groups. And so it might be that that's the kind of general shape that phonological and morphosyntax capacities exhibit, is exactly that kind of structure. And crucially, the kind of story, the kind of Chomsky-inspired story here requires that there be something like that because, of course, languages have these features. The claim is not that they don't exist; it's just they're not part of UG. And so, you know, the kind of frame has to buy what people are selling in these kinds of domains because they're features of language, but they're not plausibly attributed to UG. So, I mean, and it would make sense around this kind of story if it was a repurposing of a kind of merge-based thing.
If there's time, I'll come back to the encryption question.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm sort of winging it here because I'm not familiar with these recent theories like the one you mentioned. But it seems to me you can imagine a domain of which early hominins had. One might be social hierarchy. It also might be a social group of a particular size and complexity, which might or might not involve hierarchy. Then there's also domains of planning stuff that's over the horizon or planning the next steps in making a tool or whatever it is. And then, so associated with that, you may have forms of life of sort of cultural habits of how the group does that sort of thing. And then these things sort of must everything has to co-evolve, which is the tricky thing about this. But then there's pressures to communicate, and there's stuff to categorize, and there's stuff to think about. And I am wondering, like that gentleman, whether on the one hand, it would seem like a social hierarchy might make a nice tree structure which could be perhaps imported to another domain. The capacity to think of, well, this is the parent baboon and these are the, these are her children who she protects or something. On the other hand, the sorts of plans you make when you're, all of our actions probably have a somewhat hierarchical nature. And I will admit that that applies to creatures that don't have language, I assume, of a certain complexity. I don't know how much, I'm mostly familiar with pets and how much they don't cognize and how much they do. But one thing about a plan and then a series of steps to do that plan is that it can combine a hierarchical structure with a sequential structure, which is something that language does well.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, I think these are both candidates for, insofar as this merge thing is that important, which I'm not entirely convinced of, but then I come from the opposite tradition, that both of these things are possible candidates for it.
Yeah, so the integration of the structure-dependent generative operation with one that deals with linear order, I think is essential for doing complex communication. And if the basic property that I started with, you could either think of that as a property that individuals have to produce or process novel sentences, but it's also a fact about groups, that they're able to communicate information, that neither of them, Frege famously remarked that what makes language so astonishing is that I can have a thought, put it in a form of words that you can understand. And so, if you take the basic property to be a fact about communication, then I think you have to think not just about structure-dependent rules that have generative features, but integrating those with linear order, because you also need not just the means of computing the meanings, but expressing the meanings in a form that other people will be able to identify. And because of the way in which, in some sense, I'm talking about the prolegomena, the preconditions that would enable that kind of complex system of communication to come about, I've been kind of less focused on the linear order questions. But I think when you start really thinking about how the kinds of systems of communication, not just systems of cognition, that modern humans have, you have to think about the integration of those things. And I should say, I'm not opposed to thinking that the need to do that kind of integration of structure-dependent and linear order might give rise to certain kind of biological-based changes of their own. So I'm not. Chomsky has wanted to say that merge is all there is that's specific to language. I think that's interesting, but I think that's just a working hypothesis, and it could turn out that lots of phonology is likewise comes about through this kind of culturally driven process of genetic assimilation. Clark? Sure.
Yeah, so first, thanks for a great talk. So taking seriously this idea that like the social hierarchical context is sort of like the context for understanding a possible process of genetic assimilation. I think that fits nicely with like the data from like Lita and John's study of social exchange, and so I'm just wondering like to what extent you would expect, based on, if I'm understanding the account you put forward here correctly, like to what extent does just reframing any type of, structured reasoning, like reframing it in social terms, facilitate that sort of, reasoning about it, or is it, do you think there's something specific to social exchange, or like, what's the...
No, I mean, I think that because across the social domain, you have the need to keep track of individuals over time, store them in memory, and then you kind of define some structural operations over those things. That's the kind of our context, and that can take place in the context of immediate face-to-face interaction, but also through the kind of more Machiavellian processes that other primates also exhibit as well, where you're trying to strategize about how to exploit an individual unaware, unbeknownst, in ways that are unbeknownst to them. And so I kind of think the social world is playing this foundational role across the kinds of contexts that individuals engage in social interaction. But I mean, part of the thing that I guess, again, I'm emphasizing is the way in which, yes, the social world, this is really broad thing, and don't try to reduce it all to communication. Communication is not, all of my existing work has all been on communication. So far be it from me to downplay the importance of communication. But the point is that in some way, when you think about language, I think you need to think about things that are outside of just those face-to-face dialogue-like interactions. I think that those are especially important when you start thinking about these kinds of features of language, the morphosyntactic and phonological features of language. But when you think about the syntactic and semantic features of language, those are going to just apply across all the different kind of social contexts in which individuals find themselves in.
Okay. Do we have time for?
Yeah, last
okay.
question.
I'll keep it brief, but I think that we'll probably have to continue this discussion into the future. Thanks for this. I think it's a great account that you've offered, and it's very plausible, it strikes me. In fact, it seems like it's so plausible that, I mean, there's multiple different versions of this that would all be plausible, including like a culture first kind of thing, but then you could also have a mutation first kind of thing as the enabling condition that then, right? So I guess my question is, I mean, I know that your enterprise is to create a plausible, I mean, that's the bar that you set for yourself, right? Then empirically, is there any hope of ever teasing apart, do you think that there are any signatures that we could find that would point to one story or another about how this might have happened?
So signatures with respect to part,
like, for example, this idea that maybe there was a very domain-specific ability that then became expanded, as you suggested, would be one scenario that for the genetic change, there was some rewiring change that allowed the Seyfarth type system to then become the basis for.
Yeah, I guess, one thing is to just conceptually, because I'm here as the conceptual engineer, how the machine works, that's above my pay grade, is just to think about the differences between the initial emergence of something and its stabilization over time. And so I think that part of the reason why I'm emphasizing more the cultural first style account is because of the way in which I think it helps not just explain the emergence, but also its stabilization over time. And so I think that if you're just thinking about kind of pure mutation-based stories, those may explain how they came about, but the persistence and spread, well, then you're going to start talking about other things. And so I think just think maybe the point is think about each of those two kinds of problems at the same time, emergence and persistence and spread. In terms of I don't think, I'll end on a positive note. I mean, the other thing that Chomskyans have tended to do is to argue that there's no evidence here and this is all just kind of storytelling. And I do think that there is, I think in this domain we should be kind of evidential omnivores and just eating every bit of evidence that's possibly available. And I think that when you take that kind of more omnivorous perspective on the evidential base of the science, it's not implausible that you will find evidential signatures that will favor one account over the other. What those are, I'm not enough of an expert on genomics or on development to tell you what those would be, but I'm not unhopeful of the ability to find some such evidential sources.